Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now joining us on Facebook Live. We have the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for a parallel event to the 46th session of the Human Rights Council, co-organized by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Earth Justice, and the Geneva Environment Network. This event is also sponsored by the Human Rights Core Group on Human Rights and the Environment. Let me then take this occasion to mention that we have in this core group Costa Rica, the Republic of Maldives, the Kingdom of Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland. Today, David Boyd, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, will present the report on human rights for a healthy biosphere that he presented to the United Nations General Assembly last October. This report discusses the need for urgent action to conserve, protect, and restore the biosphere on which all species depend, and comes at a timely moment, as we will hear from today's leading experts that have joined the Special Rapporteur, and that we will have the pleasure to introduce as they intervene. This event will be facilitated by Yves Lador, the representative of Earth Justice in Geneva, and myself. Let me also remind you that the video of this event and the presentations made, as well as a summary, will be available online on the web page of this event. You can raise your questions in the Q&A box for who is on the WebEx, in the comments for who is on social networks, and we will address them in the last part of this session. Before Yves takes the floor to introduce this session, we will have some introductory remarks from members of the Human Rights Council Core Group on Human Rights and the Environment. And we will start by the Republic of the Maldives. I see that Ambassador Ahmed is with us. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues and participants, good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking the co-organizers of the event, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Mr. David Boyd, Earth Justice, and the Geneva Environment Network. Maldives, as you know, is a country heavily dependent on environmental resources, and we appreciate the report presented by Mr. Boyd to the UNGA, where he had discussed the need for urgent action to conserve, protect, and restore ecosystems and the biosphere. In the Maldives, our environment is our future, and how we protect it is crucial to the health and wealth of our nation. Both our fisheries sector and tourism sector directly depend on the quality of our environment. We currently have 3 entire atolls designated as UNESCO Biosphere reserves in Maldives. Each reserve supports its own biodiversity within its coral reefs, mangroves, and wetland systems. The reef systems are home to a diverse range of fish, including other marine life and significant populations of sharks. These reserves also play an important role for migratory birds, some of which are endemic. We also have a ban on both shark and turtle fishing in the Maldives, as well as coral mining. To ensure that we leave a healthy and sustainable environment for future generations, we need to act now and change the ways that we manage our environment. I am pleased to inform that the resolution on environment at the current council session will highlight the importance of the biosphere and the need to protect the environment. And in line with past practice, I hope the resolution will be adopted by consensus this year as well. Allow me to conclude my brief remarks by thanking the organizers once again for holding this important and timely event. It always gives me great pleasure to exchange views about these issues that are close to our heart. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. We have also Switzerland, and we have with us Maxime Weber from the Permanent Mission in Geneva, who would like to add some introductory remarks. Maxime, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Special Rapporteur, Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends. First, let me congratulate the Geneva Environmental Network on behalf of Switzerland for organizing this event. Once again, the Geneva Environmental Network demonstrates its ability to bring together the right people at the right time and thus showcase its outstanding convening power. Currently, we're going through a very challenging times from an environmental and climate change perspective. It is in our interest in these disruptive times to take advantage of new opportunities in order to solve the pressing problems. The current pandemic clearly shows that we depend on a healthy environment. Rarely has it been so evident that the enjoyment of human rights and environmental protection are mutually reinforcing. There is a lesson to be learned from the pandemic. We better listen to what the scientists are saying. The scientific community issues constant warning about the devastating impact of climate change, loss of biodiversity, and other aspects of environmental degradation. So we must act now. There are no excuses. The 1990s marked a turning point in the history of multilateralism related to world trade and multilateral environmental engagement. This includes the recognition of their interrelationship. The recognition became the showcase of the necessity for overarching policies on sustainable development. 30 years later, we should be ready to engage in a profound discourse on the interlinkages between the realization and enjoyment of human rights and the prerequisites of a healthy biosphere. Both policies can and should be mutually reinforcing. However, if not implemented in tandem, they are both bound to fail. Switzerland, as a member of the core group on human rights and the environment, is keen to work on progress in this regard. Thanks to the dedicated engagement by personalities like Special Rapporteur Dr. David Boyd and his predecessor, we are now advancing. I thank you very much.
To Maxime. Yves, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the first presentation we have just heard. They are really an excellent way to start this discussion. And let me just say a few words in order to introduce the report we are going to talk about today. And first, I'd like to thank David Boyd for being with us from Vancouver, and it's pretty early in Vancouver. I don't know if you already have the daylight and if you can see the sea from your window, David, but really thank you very much for being with us today. I'd just like to remind, and that's probably obvious for everybody, but it's good to remind that you are one of the leading legal scholar in environmental law, and that you are actually right now finishing the 3 first years of your mandate as a special rapporteur on human rights and the environment. You're the second mandate holder. It was just said before by Switzerland. The mandate was first held by Professor John Knox, and so now you are continuing his work. And right now, there should be a renewal at this session of your mandate for the second term of 3 years. Now, the report, as it was said before, was presented to the United Nations General Assembly last October in New York. And I'd just like to make it very clear for everybody, because it's not always easy to follow all of these process, that this is not the report that you presented currently to the Human Rights Council. The present report was on the water crisis, and there was a very substantial meeting about that a few days ago, the 2nd of March. So here we are really focusing on what you presented last October. And the reason, as you had said at that time in New York, the reason for presenting this report on biodiversity at that time was that normally, if it had not been for COVID, we should have had 2 very important events in 2020, which is the IUCN World Conservation Congress, which now will take place in September in Marseille this year, and the 15th Conference of the Party of the Convention of Biodiversity, which is also planned for fall in Kunming in China. So it's good that we can discuss this now, also because, as it was said by His Excellency Ambassador Ahmed, this is part also of the resolution, which is currently these days, and actually even this afternoon, being discussed and negotiated on human rights and the environment, which will renew your mandate and also present some substantial elements concerning this link between human rights and biodiversity. So actually what is interesting is that among the different unfortunate 3 crises that we have to face in the field of environment, which is the pollution crisis or the climate crisis, the crisis on biodiversity is the one where the linkages with the human rights have been the least discussed and elaborated. Your predecessor, John Knox, did already a report in 2017, and he focused on the procedural approaches to that. So now your report is part of a series of reports that you are presenting to the Human Rights Council, which focuses more on the substantial dimension of environmental rights, and precisely here on the substantial dimension of the linkages between human rights and biodiversity. So we're really very happy to have you with us, happy to discuss here in Geneva a report that was presented in New York, because unfortunately here the reports who are presented to the UNG in New York often go to not well noticed, a bit like if what happens in New York stays in New York. So now we're very happy to bring this discussion from New York to Geneva, and the floor is yours. David?
Great, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a delight to be with you all here in Geneva. I wish I was there with you in person today, but obviously that is not possible. So as you all know, this beautiful blue-green planet Earth is the only planet in the universe that is known to support life. This unique planet is home to an extraordinary diversity of life, from giraffes to gorillas, from insects to bears. And it's interesting that people don't recognize, but humans actually share DNA, the basic building block of life, with all species, indicating that nature is a community to which we belong, rather than a commodity intended for us to exploit. All human rights ultimately depend on a healthy biosphere. Without functioning ecosystems, which depend on healthy biodiversity, there would be no clean air to breathe, no safe water to drink, and no nutritious food to eat. A teaspoon of healthy soil contains billions of microorganisms, algae, bacteria, fungi, that feed plants and protect them from pests and pathogens. Healthy ecosystems provide a renewable supply of wood, fiber, food, fish, and other goods. And healthy ecosystems also regulate the Earth's climate, filter air and water, recycle nutrients, and mitigate the impacts of natural disasters. And yet, our activities are destroying biological diversity at a rate that is unprecedented in human history. Wildlife populations have fallen by approximately 68% since 1970. The rate of extinction is hundreds of times higher than the average over the past 10 million years and is accelerating. 1 million species are at risk of extinction, according to the Intergovernmental Science Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service. And the causes of this are clear. Since 1970, the human population has doubled, the global economy has quadrupled, and global trade has multiplied by a factor of 10, which has sent demand for materials and energy skyrocketing. So through all of these activities, we are literally eroding the very foundations of our health, our livelihoods, and our economies, with devastating consequences for human rights. Next slide. The COVID-19 pandemic actually provides a striking example of this. COVID-19 is the latest emerging infectious disease to spill over from other species into humans. And more than 70% of emerging infectious diseases in recent decades have had zoonotic origin, including HIV/AIDS, Ebola, Nipah virus, Marburg virus, and various strains of avian influenza. The growing risk of these diseases is caused by human activities that damage ecosystems, including deforestation, land use, land clearing and conversion for agriculture, the illegal wildlife trade, and intensified livestock production. States have created hundreds of treaties and declarations promising to protect nature, including the 1992 Convention on Biodiversity. Yet there's a huge implementation and enforcement gap. States failed to meet any of the 2010 nature targets and failed to meet any of the 2020 Aichi biodiversity targets. So states are not responding with appropriate urgency to the dire warnings issued by the world's leading scientists. On the contrary, states encourage damage to ecosystems and biodiversity by providing more than $500 billion annually in subsidies that harm nature, which is more than 5 times what states spend to protect biodiversity. So the degradation of ecosystems and the decline of biodiversity, as I mentioned earlier, have profound consequences for the enjoyment of human rights. Among the human rights threatened and violated include the rights to life, health, food, a healthy environment, water, an adequate standard of living, culture, indigenous peoples' rights, and the rights of the child. Communities protected by healthy mangrove ecosystems are less likely to suffer deaths caused by cyclones, which protects the right to life. Healthy ecosystems provide a buffer against emerging infectious diseases, safeguarding the rights to life and the right to health. Insects, bats, and birds pollinate more than 75% of crops, essential for fulfilling the right to food. The destruction of ecosystems and biodiversity violates the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. Because of their strong dependence on nature, indigenous peoples and local communities are disproportionately harmed by ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. However, indigenous peoples and local communities and peasants can make enormous contributions to conserving and sustainably using biodiversity when empowered to do so through recognition of their rights. So my report argues that states should apply a rights-based approach to all aspects of conserving, protecting, restoring, and using and benefiting from healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. Examples of the procedural obligations of states include providing the public with accessible information about the global nature crisis, ensuring inclusive, equitable, and gender-based approaches to public participation, protecting the environmental human rights offenders who are defending ecosystems from violence, harassment, and intimidation, and enabling affordable and timely access to justice and effective remedies for all to ensure accountability. When we turn to the substantive obligations, states must, for example, and there are more examples of this in my report, but states must monitor and report on the state of biodiversity, implement national biodiversity plans, create protected areas, and establish other effective conservation measures, enact and implement legislation to protect endangered species, and restore degraded ecosystems. With respect to indigenous peoples, states must recognize their land titles, tenures, and rights, acknowledging the existence of different customs and governance systems, including collective ownership, and similar measures should be taken for local communities and peasants. Businesses and large conservation organizations must do more to respect human rights and do no harm in their work. As I do in all of my reports, I like to highlight good practices. And so there's an annex to my report on human rights in the healthy biosphere, which contains hundreds of inspiring examples of good practices in the conservation, protection, and sustainable use of biodiversity, including the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, led by Costa Rica and France, the European Green Deal, and the African Great Green Wall. In conclusion, my report provides detailed recommendation for states in 4 key and interrelated areas. We have to have a carbon neutral, nature positive economic recovery from the pandemic. We need urgent action to target the key drivers of these zoonotic diseases. We must accelerate action to protect and conserve nature. And we must respect the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, and peasants as we make progress in our conservation targets. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is not too late to respond to the global nature crisis, but time is running out. The ongoing failure to conserve, protect, and sustainably use the Earth's ecosystems exacerbates inequality and has catastrophic consequences for the enjoyment of human rights. Today, the world's leading scientists are all calling for rapid, systemic, and transformative changes to address the climate emergency, the nature crisis, and to avoid future pandemics. As my friend from Switzerland said, with COVID-19, humanity is paying a terrible price for ignoring the warnings of scientists. We must not make that mistake again. Employing a rights-based approach can serve as a catalyst for accelerated action to protect nature. History demonstrates through the progress achieved by abolitionists, suffragettes, civil rights activists, and indigenous peoples, the powerful role of human rights in sparking transformative societal changes. As I have said many times and will continue to say at every opportunity, the time is now for the United Nations to recognize through resolutions at the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly that the time has come to recognize the right of everyone, everywhere, to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Thanks to all of you for everything you are doing to advance human rights and protect this miraculous, wonderful planet that we're all so lucky to call home. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, David, for this excellent presentation of your report. We will now hear from leading experts from key institutions engaged in protecting and restoring our ecosystems, on the conclusions of your report, and perhaps also on the links with the upcoming negotiations that Yves has mentioned earlier. And we will start by Suzanne Gardner, who is the Director of the Ecosystems Division of the United Nations Environment Programme, the voice of the environment in the UN system. Suzanne, over to you.
Thank you so much. Certainly, David made a very strong case for nature as the foundation for human well-being. The right to health is recognized as a fundamental right, and yet healthy people cannot live on a sick planet. The increasingly visible impacts of decades of unsustainable consumption and production, climate change, loss of biodiversity is taking its toll, and we're all starting to see that better now. We know now better than ever, and David really, I think, very strongly made this case, that we know that to seek to conserve nature is in fact seeking to conserve humanity. And just last week at the UN Environment Assembly meeting, member states recognized that the planet's facing 3 true global crises that affect all of humanity. We have the biodiversity crisis, with around 1 million animals and plants species threatened with extinction. We have the climate crisis. The world is set to see its warmest 5 years on record. And this trend is going to continue if we don't change the path we're on. And we have a pollution crisis, with plastics pouring into oceans at an estimated rate of about a dump truck per minute, which is about 8 million tons per year. Certainly 2020, I think we all felt like we were in the eye of the storm. For many people throughout the world, they were experiencing true environmental disasters. If it was flash floods in Afghanistan or hurricanes in Central America, wildfires that we saw in the US and Australia, all of this was punctuated by the pandemic. We can discuss numbers and we can talk about statistics, and that gives us the good facts to look at, but they really don't convey what it feels like. What it feels like, for example, to have your home, your childhood, your livelihood, or your nation destroyed. And how does one easily convey the impact of climate change on crop production, for example? People who depend on nature, hand to mouth, as they're seeing rains or seasons shift. And how do we put into words what it means to have the loss of a forest, so closely tied not only to people's basic resources, but to their medicines and their culture, their traditions, and their deepest sense of place and identity? And how do we describe the desperation of climate refugees who are forced into intolerable situations, just trying to make ends meet? So many throughout the world have these similar stories. And this makes our work even more urgent to address these crises, to make a healthy environment universally recognized as part of our basic human rights. UNEP supports a rights-based approach to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Human rights and the environment are intertwined. Human rights can't be enjoyed without a safe, clean, healthy environment. And sustainable environmental governance can't exist without respect for human rights. For us, environmental rights means any proclamation of a human right to an environmental condition with specified quality. This relationship is increasingly recognized, as I'm sure we'll hear from all the panelists today. It's a right to a healthy environment that's enshrined in over 100 national constitutions. And this pandemic has really highlighted that we have to protect the environment now and address inequality if we're going to achieve the 2030 vision of living in harmony with nature. UNEP is very pleased to see that the Human Rights Council is addressing the issue again at its current session. Just in August of last year, the International Land Coalition reported on numerous cases throughout the world where indigenous people and local communities were under threat just for protecting their lands and the environment during the pandemic. And this is something we just can't afford to backslide on. So what do? Well, we need to strengthen the human rights aspect of existing global frameworks, that's for sure, including the Conference of Parties of the 3 Rio Conventions, as David mentioned, that are taking place later this year. We need to do much more to really link biodiversity ambition with real concrete world achievements that benefit the most marginalized people. And we know that biodiversity threats are increasing. We know that we haven't fully met our biodiversity goals that we set for ourselves a decade ago. And we know that areas that are managed by indigenous peoples and local communities are faring better than the others. Comprising less than 5% of the world's population, indigenous peoples protect 80% of global biodiversity, including some of the most ecologically intact forests and biological hotspots. Areas of the world projected to experience significant negative effects from environmental degradation are also the home to large concentrations of indigenous peoples. It's also important to note that women and girls are hit even harder by environmental disasters and climate change, and they're more likely even than men to live in poverty, and it makes them more vulnerable. Any conversation on rights, we need to make sure that we include the important roles that women play in safeguarding livelihoods and the social fabric for sustainable landscapes and climate change adaptation, especially at the grassroots level. Rights and leadership of indigenous people and local communities has been recognized in recent commitments. Over 45 countries have pledged their support for the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People that aims to protect 30% of the planet's lands and seas. And 81 countries have signed on the Leaders' Pledge for Nature at the UN Biodiversity Summit just last September. But we know pledges are not enough. We need to ensure that a strong post-2020 biodiversity framework is adopted and that there's the necessary investments to implement it. It's essential that indigenous peoples and local communities' rights should be mainstreamed in the processes and actions that stem from these key international agreements on these 3 conventions for biodiversity, climate, and desertification. And nature-based solutions can help achieve both climate and biodiversity solutions at the same time while protecting livelihoods and rights. They can actually, just through nature-based solutions, they can provide 1/3 of the emissions reductions that's needed to keep the world on track to the 1.5 degree goal set out by the Paris Agreement. And for every US dollar that you spend investing in ecosystem restoration, you can generate over $9 in returns of ecosystem services and benefits to livelihoods. 2021 kicks off the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, which is a huge opportunity to really raise the ambition on action. This is led by UNEP and FAO. The decade will leverage existing national, regional, and global efforts on restoration to deliver both resilience for climate change, but also for climate change mitigation, for food security, and for biodiversity conservation. But ecosystem restoration involves a redistribution of rights and resources, and it's essential that restoration is fair and that it respects and enhances the rights and resources of the poorest and most vulnerable. And for that reason, the UN Decade and its partners will develop systems for effective and appropriate collaboration with indigenous peoples and groups and communities as a key aspect of the strategy. Truly, the facts are clear. We're not doing enough. We know that. For decades, conservation efforts, including the designation of national parks and other protected areas, led to the displacement and denied access to traditional territories of indigenous peoples and local communities, affecting their right and access to food, water, culture, livelihoods. The UN is taking action in a number of ways. We saw the United Nations System Chief Executives Board for Coordination endorse a call to action on Indigenous peoples just in November 2020, which aims to build an inclusive, sustainable, and resilient future with Indigenous peoples. And UNEP is also taking action. In 2018, UNEP adopted an internal policy on promoting greater protection for environmental defenders. We supported more than 100 environmental defenders across the world to exercise their human rights to a healthy environment. And just in March of 2019, the UN Human Rights Council lauded this policy and called for it on other UN bodies to adopt similar approaches. Finally, in conclusion, we need to formally recognize these rights to a healthy environment at the international level. In his recent State of the Planet speech, the UN Secretary General reiterated that environmental laws have growing reach. At least 155 United Nations member states are now legally recognized that a healthy environment is a basic human right. So we know what must be done. We know that now we need to figure out how to do it. We have to do it quickly, and we have to ensure that it has teeth. Formal recognition of the right to a healthy environment by states would help to elevate environmental rights alongside other long recognized human rights and give us a legal tool to stop our current planet destroying trajectory and truly set ourselves and our future generations on a better course for living in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. We will now move to Trevor Sandwith, the Director of Global Protected Areas Program at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Trevor, over to you.
Good day, everybody, and thanks so much for the invitation and also for the keynote address, which helps us focus on some really important issues. In my thoughts about this presentation, I clearly am going to echo some of the considerations that we've already heard. But today I'd like to focus particularly on the mutual consideration of fairness and equity in protected and conserved areas and their ability to conserve biodiversity and other significant values. So I'm picking up on a very important thread of David's report. The Special Rapporteur's report highlights that when protected areas do not respect substantive and procedural rights, they will have negative impacts on people, on society, and on sustainability. But also that when governance breaks down, when the rights of those at a local level are not respected, that biodiversity outcomes will be compromised. So this is a kind of a negative vicious cycle if one doesn't intervene. The report also highlights the independence of the right of people to an environment that promotes their health and well-being and respect for the rights to identity, justice, and equity. So speaking from the point of view of IUCN, the recognition of this mutual dependence of people and nature is paramount, evidenced by numerous resolutions that have been taken by the IUCN World Conservation Congress over the 70 years plus of IUCN's existence. It's the DNA, if you like, of IUCN to look at justice and equity in relation to nature. And probably one of the things that IUCN really has striven for is to uphold standards. We heard the reference made to quality. It's not just how much, it's how well. It's not just who, it's what's the process. And that includes for protected and conserved areas that maintain that successful conservation must achieve both biodiversity and social outcomes. There can be no conservation of biodiversity without also achieving beneficial social outcomes. One standard that I can refer to, and perhaps people would like to know more about, is the IUCN standard for the green list of protected and conserved areas. We often hear about the the calamity that the environment is in, and we have red lists of threatened species, but we should also be focusing on what is being done right and how it can be amplified. So when we try and measure the performance of protected and conserved areas across a wide range of variables, for example, through the well-established methods of management effectiveness assessment, which is widely applied globally, including through investments by the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, and implementing agencies, it's quite apparent that we can try and understand which variables are the best predictors of successful outcomes. And I don't think it would be any surprise to any of you to understand that it is variables about governance, equity, rights, and social justice that are actually the best predictors of successful outcomes. So one could make this isn't just about mutual interdependence, it's actually dependence. Without social justice, procedural rights, and fairness, there will be no effective conservation, and we can prove that through the data that has been gathered in many places. So moving to a fourth point, contemporary conservation practice is really still dominated, at least apparently, by governance by government. Governments are, generally speaking, have the authority to set laws, to set standards, and to inform practice everywhere. But as all of you know, there are also other governance actors, and we are at least seeing through the decisions of the Convention on Biodiversity over the years, increasing recognition of the role of other governance actors, including indigenous peoples and local communities, private actors, but probably more importantly, combinations of governance by government, governance by indigenous peoples, private actors, and local communities, forms of shared governance. And this brings us to a kind of a realization that a lot of this governance is hidden. It's there, as was referred to. Large parts of the planet are conserved by people, but these are not recognized. They're not recognized in the government systems or reported through to the international conventions, so that we can have 15% of the Amazon, for example, formally designated in protected areas in the various countries that contribute to this reporting. But the whole of the Amazon is conserved, including by areas that are under the custodianship of indigenous peoples and local communities. So these traditions are not the recent contemporary version of conservation. These are often age-old traditions rooted in culture, spiritual appreciation of nature, and involving traditional ways and understanding of how to conserve and steward the environment. So the critical issue, if we are going to deal with this wider area of conserved areas, is that they are appropriately recognized, that they are supported, and we've also heard the use of the word defended. Many of these areas are, if you like, at risk, or they're on the cusp. They could go one way or the other if the rights of the custodians of these places are not appropriately recognized and supported. We are facing a calamity in plain sight. So it's a kind of hidden conservation that isn't really taken into account quite often. So going to my last point, really, it's starting to talk about the future. It seems to be a growing and widespread agreement that the world needs to have much more ambitious targets to be able to stem the loss of biodiversity and the loss of ecosystem services on which all humanity and the persistence of nature depends. It's easy to message that, as we need more protected and conserved areas. However, we haven't yet asked ourselves the question, are they not already there in the hands of people who are their custodians and who have the motivation to ensure that they persist into the future? It would be a great disservice to the many custodians of nature who are out there to somehow co-opt, if you like, their efforts into systems that do not involve them in appropriate ways and without their free, prior, and informed consent. So just to move to perhaps a closing remark, really, to put this into action, we need a very concerted effort to look at the recognition of the rights of the custodians of nature, understand where and how biodiversity is conserved by these custodians, and make sure that we have the mechanisms, including investment, the right kind of investment, to support, defend, and integrate them into the whole effort that the world must make to address this calamity. This is really, I think, the mission that we in IUCN, through the World Conservation Congress, through resolutions that do recognize and defend the defenders of nature, must ensure happens. And the agreements on the Global Biodiversity Framework later this year must ensure that the highest standards for both governance and management are in place to maintain the existence and sustainability of life on Earth and the life of the custodians. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Let's now move to our next speaker, Luthando Dziba, who is the head of the conservation services of the South African National Parks. And Luthando is also the co-chair of the multidisciplinary expert panel of IPBES. IPBES is, as we all know, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, providing these important assessments on the state of our biodiversity. Luthando, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diane, and want to again to thank the organizers for the invitation, and also to thank this report by the special rapporteur, which highlights, I think, very important issues that link human rights to biodiversity. I think it is a very timely report, especially considering the pandemic that we are going through and the linkages between the loss of biodiversity and a number of issues that relate to pandemics. I want to just perhaps echo a number of points that the report makes, but also echo these particularly from the perspective that emerges from the IPBES assessments, which the report cites quite substantially, because I think there's important issues there to recognize. I think, the special rapporteur makes a very strong point, right from the onset in his report, when he states that all human rights ultimately depend on a healthy biosphere. Without healthy functioning ecosystem, which depend on healthy biodiversity, there would be no clean air to breathe, safe water to drink, or nutritious food to eat. But he also makes a point that human damage to the biosphere is having major impacts on health, livelihoods, and rights. And perhaps I want to just allude to some of the issues that IPBES assessments have found, or findings of the IPBES assessments, including the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which was published in 2019, which noted that life on Earth is deteriorating very fast, and this is happening worldwide. That all indicators of the global state of nature are decreasing, whether you're looking at biomes, or you're looking at ecosystems, or you're looking at species or breeds. All of these indicators are basically in a state of decline. And this loss is a direct result of human activity and constitute a direct threat to human well-being in all regions of the world. And I think one of the questions that arises is what is driving this? There are direct drivers such as changes in land use and sea use that are key to driving some of the losses that we are witnesses. Direct exploitation of biodiversity is definitely one of the key drivers. Climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species in that order follow these. And I think key then about how to intervene and look at options for halting biodiversity should definitely look at these drivers. What can be done in order to mitigate some of the impact of these drivers on biodiversity and therefore on human well-being? There are indirect drivers that include, among other issues of governance and accountability, but also a growing human population and growing per capita consumption, which are things that are definitely within the sphere of influence of basically everybody, on the planet. And I think it is an important recognition that, we can change some of our behaviors in ways that can contribute meaningfully to halting the loss of biodiversity and therefore to basically improving human well-being across the globe. Some of the findings, are paint quite a dire picture, such as the fact that 75% of the terrestrial environment and 66% of the marine environment has been severely altered by human actions to date. Of the 8 million total estimated number of animal and plant species on Earth, up to 1 million species are threatened with extinction, and that within the next couple of decades. And so when one looks at this, one realizes that, the loss of biodiversity and its impact on human well-being is not something in the distant future that we can only imagine. It is something that is basically within our reach and happening now in some cases, such as the experience that we have now with this global pandemic. More than 85% of wetlands that were present in 1700 have been lost or had been lost by 2000. And wetlands actually being lost at 3 times the rate at which forests are being lost. And this is an important thing because if you look at biodiversity that is associated with wetlands, if you look at ecosystem services, including clean quality water, that comes from wetland areas, such losses are losses that have got a huge impact on human well-being. And whilst that has been happening, there has been a significant growth in food production. For instance, a growth of about 300% in food production since 1917. And since 1980, there has been a 15% increase in global per capita consumption of materials that nature produces. So we are exploiting these resources that are in decline at an ever increasing rate. And so our impacts are definitely significant and continue to impact negatively on nature. I really appreciated, the points that both, I think, in fact, all of the 3 speakers, including the rapporteur, that were making about the role of indigenous peoples. And I think IPBES has been trying hard to find ways of understanding how to integrate indigenous and local people's knowledge into our understanding of the biosphere, and also how to ensure that they are the knowledge that they bring is meaningfully recognized. The innovations and practices in their institutions and values are being meaningfully recognized, because without that, we will definitely impact negatively on their rights and their quality of life, including, for instance, things that they do for enhancing or entrenching their cultural identity, but also things that are quite important for their well-being, including access to medicinal plants and to food that comes from natural resources in where they live, and I think one of the things that becomes then clear is that everything that we are doing needs to make a special recognition for the role that indigenous peoples play, you know, in the management of natural resources, and also like a recognition of what is important to them, you know, so that they have a voice, you know, in the design of policies, whether at a national level or at an international level. Now coming to the pandemic, IPBES, at about the same time that the Special Rapporteur released this report, also published a report on biodiversity and pandemics. And I think, you know, the parallels between, you know, like, I mean, the findings that the Special Rapporteur reports on, you know, and the IPBES report, you know, are quite striking, you know. One, like, I mean, the fact that the majority, about 70% of emerging diseases are caused by, you know, microbes of animal origin, which spill over due to contact among wildlife, livestock, and people. But, you know, the key thing here is that, you know, mammals, especially bats, rodents, and primates, and some birds, as well as livestock, are the primary reservoirs of pathogens that cause pandemics. And our association and interaction with these as humans, you know, which has increased even more as biodiversity is lost, you know, significantly increases the risk, you know, for pandemics, you know. And I think one of the things that, you know, we see is that this risk is driven by exponentially increasing, you know, like, I mean, impacts of humans on the environment. And so we can't blame wildlife, you know, for having, you know, like, I mean, this diversity of microbes or microorganisms, but we should actually take responsibility as people for how we relate and manage the natural environment in ways that can actually, you know, be positive for both people and nature. So unsustainable exploitation of the environment is not an option. It is good, it is bad for people, it is bad for nature. I think in conclusion, I want to highlight, I think, a point that has been made over and over, that you know, the current negative trends in biodiversity and ecosystems continue to undermine progress towards you know, achievement of sustainable development goals, and a change that is needed, you know, may only be achieved, or our ability to achieve the kind of progress we need will only be possible through transformative changes across economic, social, political, and technological spheres. And so it has to be holistic. It cannot necessarily be just in the environment sector. It has to cut across, you know, multiple sectors. And I think over and over, a point has been made that it is important that we do not ignore, you know, the evidence base that is out there, the science that is out there. And I think there's no clear way to support science and evidence than to act on it and to champion it. And I think I want to commend here again the Special Rapporteur, you know, for drawing very, you know, heavily on good and more recent evidence to present, you know, in his report. And I think that, you know, it is encouraging for platforms like IPBES to be able to contribute, you know, meaningfully, you know, sound science, you know, in ways that can possibly contribute to decision making. And we look forward to the uptake of this, for instance, at the IUCN World Conservation Congress. We also look forward to the uptake of this science and some of the recommendations emerging from the Special Rapporteur's report at the Convention of the Parties on Biological Diversity later this year in China. With that, I want to thank you, Chair, and hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luthando. We are now moving to our next speaker, who is Elaine Geyer-Allely, Deputy Leader of WWF International Governance Practice, and she's speaking with us from Nairobi. Elaine, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. Yes, greetings from Nairobi, and thanks very much for the opportunity to join this discussion. A lot has already been said, so what I'd like to do is speak briefly to three ways I think this report is helping us move ahead in how we understand, how we collaborate, and how we act for people and for nature through the recognition of the human right to a healthy environment. I think first the report really helps understand and as my colleague was just saying, provides the evidence of the vital link between human rights and the health of the environment. As we've heard from other speakers, everything on this planet is connected. We've been very slow to take full measure of those connections, but we're starting to realize just how deeply we depend on nature for our well-being, for our economies, and as multiple colleagues have said, what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is how we depend on nature for our health. This past Wednesday, I was in Port Hayden, Alaska. Of course, I was not lucky enough to be there in person, but I was lucky to be on a virtual tour of some of the work WWF and partners are doing in the Arctic. It was striking to see images of this stunningly beautiful and unique part of our Earth, but it was also painful to hear about coastal communities who are losing their homes and lands to coastal erosion due to climate change. Climate change in the Arctic is happening faster than almost everywhere else. And two dramatic manifestations of that are the disappearance of coastal sea ice and the increasing frequency of severe storms. That combination is leading to coastal erosion. We listened to a Port Hayden resident describe how they were forced to move from their Meshik village homes as the land disappeared beneath them. They had to move inland 60 miles. Not all the communities have the means to do the same, and they shouldn't need to. So we can see in this story the deep connection between substantive human rights, like the right to adequate housing, and a healthy environment. The report gives us ample evidence of these kind of links, and we need to see those reflected in the major global negotiations ahead this year, but also the decisions in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. I think secondly, the report, and indeed the full collection of work on human rights and the environment these last several years, are helping us with the critical task of building common understanding and vision so we can take more effective action for people and the planet. The important foundation laid by John Knox, David, your 2020 report, and the work you're doing now on the global water crisis and on food systems are essential to help us build a bigger, more vocal coalition of people who are looking for holistic approaches to environmental, social, and economic crises, because these are all the interconnected crises we face today. There's a lot of talk now about the recovery from the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to build sustainable and equitable societies. But we won't get there if we don't shift our understanding of how we fit in the bigger picture of life on Earth, and if we don't marry that to resolving social inequalities as well. We need to see those links in COVID recovery plans. For WWF, we see very strong alignment in the core message of the human right to a healthy environment in our mission to achieve a world where people and nature thrive together. Like many of you, we see a role to play in sharing this work with our communities and with partners and in our advocacy. We need to be more people sharing a common understanding and vision across human rights and environmental communities, between government departments and in the private and financial sectors, so that we can design more effective action to counter nature loss, environmental degradation, and climate change. Finally, David, your report made some clear recommendations to conservation organizations to more consistently implement our commitments to human rights. And I'll finish with some thoughts on that. Human rights abuses are never acceptable, including in the name of conservation. Some of you may know in 2019, WWF commissioned an independent review into how we were responding to reported human rights abuses committed by government rangers in some complex and remote places where we work. While the panel found that no WWF staff were involved, they also found that we could have done more in supporting communities to raise concerns and advocating for government partners to follow through on them. We are addressing each of the review's recommendations and have already taken a number of actions to better meet our commitments. Those include the rollout of a comprehensive environmental and social safeguard framework in all landscapes where we work, and a soon-to-be-appointed ombudsperson as two examples. We're also bringing the nexus of human rights, indigenous rights and governance, and nature conservation into the forefront of our work in many places and in our advocacy. WWF is one of the many organizations that support the goal to protect and conserve 30% of the world's land, fresh water, and oceans as part of a nature positive goal for 2030. But that can't be protection through any means. It must include, as many people have already said, that have already spoken, this must include securing the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities who have been custodians of much of the world's remaining biodiversity. We'll soon be sharing a major report that documents the conservation benefits of a rights-based approach that supports indigenous peoples and local communities. Those results are very exciting, but it's also the product of a novel and exciting collaboration, and that's what I'd like to end with. This report was developed in a collaboration between global conservation and human rights-based NGOs, global alliances, UN entities, and indigenous peoples and local community experts. It's an example of the type of collaboration we need to build going forward so that we continue to build that big and vocal coalition across our different sectors for effective action on human rights and nature conservation that we so vitally need. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. And now we move for the next speaker and the last person discussing this report, a voice from the field. Winnie Sengwer is an advocacy officer within the Defenders Coalition in Kenya. Winnie, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me in this meeting. First, I really want to appreciate David for this report because Indigenous people have been recognized. As an Indigenous woman, I am honored and I feel special here, speaking today here and just going through the report and the fact that Indigenous people's role as conservationists have been recognized. So it is so good. Thank you, David. And I want to also speak to my fellow speakers who have just finished. Everyone has mentioned Indigenous people and their role as the custodians of traditional knowledge in conservation. So thank you so much. And as a young girl, as a woman from the Sengwer Indigenous community, I feel that we have been recognized and our role has been clearly stated. So it's just us to go ahead and still fight for just conserving and protecting the biodiversity in forests. As hunter-gatherers, in the report, David stated that in the recent UN declaration, the indigenous people and peasants' rights have been to the conservation and protection of the environment. It has been recognized. So it is just our role as us to ensure that we have protected the environment. And my take on forest biodiversity and the ecosystem as a fundamental for the enjoyment of human rights is informed by the fact that indigenous persons have a spiritual connection to their land and forest diversity. We are like our connection is intertwined. You cannot separate me and the forest. So yeah, and this is informed by our background. When we indigenous people and forest people, we have clans, let me call them clans that are named after animals. And why is that? We do that so that we can preserve and conserve the animals in the forest. For instance, my clan is the colobus monkey. So whenever I go to the forest and see a colobus monkey, I won't kill it, I won't hunt it because this is my clan, this is my ancestor. I must take care of it and protect it. And our role as indigenous peoples in forest conservation is that we are doing so many activities that ensure that the biodiversity has been protected. And one of these activities is beekeeping. We do a lot of beekeeping, and beekeeping is done by first planting indigenous trees, ensuring you have beehives in the forest, and you go harvest this honey in a way that you don't harm the bees. So you do activities that conserve the forest. We collect hubs that, in fact, from the report, it states that let me just get that, I just want to quote David from the report. Okay. Okay, from the report, David stated that natural medicines in forest, that most drugs are derived from nature. And when we respect indigenous people and allow them to live freely and peacefully in the ancestral home, we will always have drugs, because 3 millions of drugs must come from trees and from the forest. Also, indigenous people do their conservation by protecting special trees. There are trees that you see a tree and you connect with it. This tree is symbolic. We have symbolic trees, and they go together with the totems, with the animals. So your family will have a symbolic tree, and it will also have a symbolic animal. So we do that so that someone in my family, when we see a certain tree, you cannot even cut a leaf, because we believe and we, like, let me say, obey that tree so much. Also, in terms of conservation by indigenous people, we have landscape and glade management skills of conservation. This is done by, when indigenous people live in the forest, there are some places that you cannot access. Inside the thick forest, it is sacred, and you can't get there. So you just live in the open grasslands, which we call the glade, and this is where we do small farming, maybe building our homes, and it does zero disturbance to the forest. So this ensures that the forests have been conserved. We also have sacred sites. As much as we have glades, we have sacred sites in the forest where a woman will not go to that site, but a man might go. This is informed by the fact that women have been treated as caretakers. So when a woman goes to the forest, they believe she will harvest a tree because she's looking for firewood to come and cook. So they tell women, you cannot get to this place because we don't allow you to harvest firewood. So when you go to this place of the forest, this is where you get your firewood and other things. But for the medicines, men go and some women go. So this ensures that there's conservation of forest and protection of the biodiversity. Yeah. In the report also, even not even in the report, even my previous speakers have mentioned that 80% of biodiversity is in the forest. And who lives in the forest? The indigenous people. So if we respect the indigenous people and their role in forest conservation, we will ensure that the 80% of the biodiversity has been protected. Yeah. Okay. And so also, apart from just forest people and indigenous people being at the forefront of in conservation, we have had issues as indigenous persons, and this is eviction from our ancestral homes. Eviction does so much in degrading the forest, because when evictions happen, if maybe I can just give an example from my community. When people are evicted, homes are burnt, people lose their properties, some people lose lives, and you lose a lot of things. You're even affected psychologically. So when evictions happen, when now the people carrying out evictions burn down homes, this leads to effect in the forest, because we don't believe in burning down a home, because anytime you burn a house, the fire might sneak into the forest, and the forest might catch fires. And we try so much to champion for us living peacefully in our ancestral home, because we still have that connection. So we believe that if we are left to live freely in our ancestral home as indigenous people, we will protect the forest, and we will continue preserving our way of life, our language, our tradition, our cultures, and even the traditional knowledge. And I want just to respond to Luthando's concern, where he says how indigenous people can be involved towards conservation. And I think one way we can do that is ensuring that in every decision-making table, we have an indigenous person to represent the voice of indigenous people, so that anytime a decision is made and it's about conservation, we have an indigenous voice, and it tells you, according to my traditional knowledge, this idea might work, this idea might not work, because as every speaker before me has spoken, I have had all of you recognizing us as the custodians of traditional knowledge. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Also, one way of ensuring that indigenous people have been used in conservation is ensuring that we first appreciate the existence of traditional knowledge, and first let us learn to conserve this traditional knowledge, because the more we grow in time, the more we tend to forget what our great grandfathers do. So what we do is try to ensure that we have preserved this traditional knowledge so that we can transfer it to generations after generations. It might not be indigenous people transferring the knowledge, but inclusion of indigenous people in decision-making tables and ensuring we have preserved this traditional knowledge leads to that knowledge being passed on to generation after generation. Also, one way of ensuring that indigenous people bring in their knowledge is ensuring that we promote their socioeconomic activities. And I'm speaking this as a hunter-gatherer, and our major activities, like I said, is beekeeping. We harvest honey, and we use honey for so many things. Honey is used for medicinal values, honey is used as a beauty product, honey is used in everything. So we can promote indigenous people activities by ensuring that we boost their activities. For instance, if we have a beekeeping community, we ensure, maybe look for funds, ensure they do now processing and packaging of honey, then they sell the honey and enhance it, so their socioeconomic well-being. And by doing this, we ensure that the forests have been conserved, because as I mentioned, for honey to be produced, we must have a tree, and for bees to come to your forest, there must be lots of trees. So that means planting lots of trees each and every other time. Plant trees, harvest honey, plant trees. And remember, inside the forest, when we plant trees, we ensure we are protecting the water towers. So there will always be flow of water. So when there's water, when there's tree, bees will be very happy. They'll come dancing in the forest. And you know, sometimes we dance to the language of bees when you're doing harvesting of honey. There's a song we sing as women, and our men are harvesting honey. We keep dancing and we keep doing all those things. So that is our role as indigenous people. And maybe just one last point on eviction. And I think eviction does a lot of degradation in the environment. So maybe still calling all of us to continue doing advocacy on indigenous people's land rights issues, so that we ensure indigenous people are left in the forest. Because it doesn't make sense to take away my right first, because I'm the primary owner of that land. So when you take away my right and evict me, first I will lose myself. Next, the forest will miss me. The trees understand our language, and we understand the language of trees. So we connect so much, and when you take us away from the forest, so much happens. I remember after the evictions of my community, was it last year? Yeah, we had a landslide. Why? Because when the people were evicted from the forest, illegal loggers got into the forest. They started harvesting trees. They started making timber. So the soil becomes loose because no more trees are there to hold the soil together. So we had landslides and people lost their lives. It's a sad state of affairs. But if indigenous people are left to take care of that forest, there will be no landslides. There will always be flow of water because we will be protecting the water catchment areas. There will be no droughts. We have had effects of climate change because everything is changing. Every time things are changing, and the weather patterns are changing. Why? Because we have not left the primary peoples and the custodians of knowledge to take care of the forest. But I always believe as an indigenous person that if we are left to voice our ways of conservation and ensure that we are the champions of environmental conservation. So much will happen. Climate change we will not have effects of climate change. We have had waters rising in the lakes because the pastoralists have been chased away from their lands, and when they are chased away, they used to plant some crops that would ensure maybe there are no flash floods or there are no prolonged droughts. But because indigenous people have not been allowed to like use their traditional knowledge, that's why we are having effects of climate change, and that is why, I don't know, so much is happening. I also want to maybe respond to, okay, not respond, but just to continue contributing to my previous speakers, that I still believe that maybe people have not understood that respecting the rights of indigenous peoples is also respecting their land rights. We always say my land right is my human right. They're intertwined. You cannot take away my land and still tell me I'm advocating for your right. That land is my right. So my land right, my right. And as we continue, maybe when we are doing a lot of advocacy around conservation and a lot of protection of biodiversity, let's always include indigenous people, because we believe that we are in the era of leaving no one behind and ensuring inclusion of voices in all decision-making tables. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
Excellent, Winnie. Thank you very much. Maybe, David, do you want to add something to what the panelists have said before we turn up to the questions?
Well, I would just actually like to thank my fellow panelists, Winnie, Luthando, Trevor, Elaine, and Susan. I think that everything you've said really is an inspiration to me, to know that there are people like you that are working on behalf of human rights and the environment. I mean, the power and the passion with which all of you have spoken, the wisdom that Winnie has shared with us, I think is encouraging. You know, we face these daunting challenges, but I believe that we do know what the solutions are, and it's simply a matter of coming together and fighting as forcefully as we can to ensure that governments are listening to our voices and taking the actions which we have so clearly identified as necessary to reverse the course of this biodiversity crisis in which we find ourselves. So thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart for everything you're doing.
Thank you, David. Malu, we have received some questions, so I will let you summarize them for our guests.
Yes, hello everybody, good afternoon. So we have a couple of questions. The first one relates to Indigenous people and COVID. So how much was the health of Indigenous people affected by COVID? And the next one is regarding the policies, talking about that the same issues remain unresolved due to red tape and politics. Shouldn't there be a prime directive really from governments and civil society for the protection of all life on Earth? So that's it at the moment.
I don't know if any one of you already would like to take one of these questions. David, we usually turn to you in these circumstances.
Sure, and so I think I'll probably reiterate to some extent what I have said earlier, but I think that, you know, we have had these international environmental agreements for decades, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they really haven't produced the results that we have been hoping for and the results that we need, quite frankly. And I think one of the major reasons behind that failure is we have failed to take a rights-based approach to the conservation of biodiversity. And once we take a rights-based approach, I think that actually is a complete game changer, because human rights provide people with accountability mechanisms, right? So whereas protecting biodiversity is seen by states as kind of an option that, you know, perhaps it's a priority for some governments, perhaps not for other governments. But when you introduce human rights into the framework, then it's no longer an option, but it's an obligation. And so that's why in my report, I really highlight how critical it is to the future of conservation that we do exactly what Winnie has said. We prioritize putting the rights and roles of Indigenous peoples and local communities in law. So, you know, they have clearly customary legal systems, but we need to ensure that those Indigenous rights to land, to water, to resources are reflected in the legal systems of all states where Indigenous peoples live. I think we also need to prioritize the type of actions that provide multiple benefits for human rights. So ecological restoration of wetlands, reforestation, for example, these are initiatives that at the same time conserve biodiversity, improve food security, reduce poverty, and address climate change. So by taking those types of integrated approaches, I think we can really move forward with great speed, the type of speed that obviously is needed. Similarly, when we talk about the types of activities that are beneficial to nature and also address climate change, we're talking about the same types of activities, right? We're talking about preventing deforestation. I mean, look at the benefits of preventing deforestation. Preventing deforestation protects the rights of Indigenous peoples. It protects biodiversity. It reduces carbon emissions. And it also protects our health and our future from these emerging infectious diseases. So deforestation needs to be a high priority. Same with the very ambitious goal of protecting 30% of the Earth's land and waters by the year 2030. As Trevor has noted, we need to recognize that large areas of land are already being protected, but are not being counted. But we also need to protect more areas that are critical for biodiversity and for carbon storage. And the only way we can do that in an equitable and effective manner is by doing so in partnership with Indigenous peoples and local communities. So I think that it's really encouraging and exciting that there's a lot of commonality to the solutions. And so, you know, I think one of my colleagues talked about the vicious cycles of degradation of nature and the decline of human well-being. I think we can actually promote virtuous cycles where we start implementing these solutions. The well-being of Indigenous peoples improves. The biodiversity of the forests recovers and is restored, and we begin to reduce the cataclysmic threat of climate change, all by taking these integrated, holistic, rights-based actions. Thank you.
No, thank you, David. Actually, the question about the efficiency and the impact of the instruments also can be addressed to UNEP and to the IUCN. So, Susan, may I first turn to you, and how do you answer to this element or the lack of efficiency that we can witness about the environmental protection instruments?
Well, one of the things we've certainly seen with the Convention on Biological Diversity is that we have to ensure that we're focused on the drivers, that we're very specific in terms of the kinds of actions that are needed to address the drivers of habitat loss, the drivers of biodiversity loss. And then we have to be very careful that we're prepared to accelerate action immediately after the agreements are made, so that we don't have the lag in looking for resources, looking for where are the tools and best practices and what coordination is needed, but instead ensure that we're really ready to accelerate action as soon as, right off the bat, as soon as an agreement is taken. So those are two ways to ensure that that there won't be the same kind of lag that we've seen before.
Oh, thank you. Very pragmatic. Trevor, may I turn to you, especially also in view of the coming IUCN Congress?
Yes, thanks very much. I can echo really what my colleagues have just said. When the question was posed, I saw two different ends of the spectrum. The one was increased accountability, as others have mentioned. I'm hoping that the negotiations for the Global Biodiversity Framework will create benchmarked targets, that we will know what we're talking about when people report against progress on those targets, that these are concrete, progressive, achieving the outcomes that are desired. We've seen with the Aichi biodiversity targets that where there were good quantified elements of those targets, they can act as an incentive and a way of reporting on progress. But that's a kind of top-down approach. I also like if you like, the virtuous cycle approach. I think we need to amplify where conservation and society works. If we can take the stories of Indigenous people successfully using traditional governance and customary law to conserve nature and amplify that message, show that it can be done, this becomes emblematic. It becomes something that inspires people for action. And I think it's a combination of, if you like, this almost like having an authoritarian accountability framework, but also saying, look, it patently works. This is the demonstration and the proof of the concept.
Well, thank you. In a way, this echoes also to the approach that the Special Rapporteur has followed, having his report, but also with the complementarity additional report on good practice, which is also a very interesting document to read. Elaine, may I turn to you for the same on this same question? You have described an interesting approach that you are developing, bringing people together and so on. Has you started this approach with different sectors, also because you were facing what you felt as being some limitation and some need to improve or innovate in your practice?
Well, specifically, if we look at this, so it's called the State of IPLC Lands report that should be, we hope, being able to be released in April. It stems actually from work that we began in 2017 in the governance practice to really put stronger focus on rights-based approaches and specifically helping Indigenous peoples and local communities where they were looking for our support to secure their rights and governance. And it grew out of conversations with colleagues from different sectors outside of the conservation sector that we really needed a more unified voice for this. And this report, as I noted, is both exciting because of what it's documenting. It's actually giving not only the extent of land of IPLCs, but also the quality, which is very high. People have already made reference to that. But it was also a process that we see as a first step in this continuing collaboration. And personally, I think it's much stronger when we're advocating to governments for specific actions. If we're not coming just from the sectors because they expect a specific message from us, but if we come together saying we all agree this is the way we need to view this, I think that'll be much stronger advocacy. We know I think we see some good signs in the Leaders Pledge that was mentioned. If we look at that, there's actually 4 different references to Indigenous peoples, either through traditional knowledge or in terms of full and effective participation. It is, though, just a pledge. It's an important sign of commitment. But I think we also see that in the global biodiversity negotiations, we really need to be many calling for the same thing because we're very far from what we're all talking about here today. So that collaboration, I think, will help us scale up our voice and make it more effective. Thanks.
Thank you. Great. So we'll have to stay tuned for April and see your report. Let me turn to our 2 last speakers, Luthando and Winnie. And Luthando, of course, if you want to jump in on what we've just been discussing, please do so. But I wanted also to add a question because we had this question coming from the floor about the impact of the COVID, and precisely IPBES has done a report on the impact of the COVID and its relation with the ecosystems. So please, the floor is yours on this element, and I'll turn afterwards to Winnie for a final word.
Oh.
Thank you very much, Yves. I think speaking about the impact of COVID-19, our report, suggests that this runs into literally trillions of dollars. For instance, when it comes to the impact on the global economy, the IPBES report estimates that perhaps that can only be accurately assessed once the vaccines have been fully deployed and once there is clarity on when indeed the level of impact that we are currently experiencing with the pandemic will be contained. However, somewhere between 8 and 16 trillion dollars had already been lost in the economies by July 2020, and the US alone, the estimate was that it might lose about 16 trillion US dollars by 2021. But I think what is key, I think, is also the disproportionate impacts, especially between communities developed versus developing, but also even within developing nations, particularly due to inequality, access, for instance, to water and sanitation, having huge impacts on people with limited resources compared to people that have got access to these services. So I think the impact has been immense, but I don't think we currently fully understand or comprehend the full extent of those impacts. And I think it will only be much clearer when the pandemic at its current rate has been contained.
Well, thank you, Luthando, and it's quite important information you're sharing right now. I can say that, and also we're so happy to have you with us, is that the IPBES reports are not as well known as, for example, the ones of the IPCC on climate. And so we've been witnessing this actually right now within the Human Rights Council. So I think that, for example, your last report on the pandemic definitely should be widely circulated so that people have a better element to start the discussion rather than just sometimes raising questions when evidence has already been provided by science. So we really look forward to continuing this discussion with IPBES. And so let me turn now to Winnie, a final word of conclusions, because we've reached the end of the moment of this discussion.
Yeah.
But as we've been hearing during this whole debate, the last word is not the least, far from that. So I don't know how the COVID has impacted, what is the impact in Kenya in general and for your community? And also if you had perhaps a very just short final word of conclusion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And maybe I will just start with maybe about the impact of COVID to the Sengwer indigenous community and maybe indigenous community in general. Of course, when the pandemic came, there was a scare in the indigenous people because they were not accessing the information. What is this disease? They never heard about it. Getting services to the medical facilities. When we were put in lockdown, people could not travel who were expecting, and we had a few cases of maternal deaths because of restriction of movement. And so people were afraid to leave their houses at night because when a police officer finds you, they beat you up because you're out there during curfew. And maybe just speaking generally, the situation of COVID in the country, there's been an increase in the number of cases now. We opened up last year and schools opened, and we are still in curfew, which starts at 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. in the morning, but then they pulled off the lockdown. So we are not in lockdown, but we still have curfew. We still have increasing cases, and we have had a few cases of students getting COVID because all our students are back in school. And you would not expect that small kids have so time because they get tired and throw the mask away. So even as speaking from indigenous people, we tried as a solution, we tried supporting women activities because we were having overwhelming requests from women, like, the pandemic is hitting us hard. We cannot even access soap. We cannot access anything. So what we did as Defenders Coalition, we supported women networks. We trained them on soap making, and then we gave them like seed funding, small monies, just to make soap and supply, so that at least people can access, as much as they have water, but were not accessing soap to wash their hands. So women were doing a lot of socioeconomic empowerment in the women network, just ensuring that at least you sell some soap to get money, because most people lost their jobs during COVID. It was hard on us. And maybe just one last word. Thank you so much, and just calling out on us to continue carrying out advocacy on land rights issues of indigenous people, because we feel by pressing our different governments in different countries to continue respecting indigenous people's land rights, maybe indigenous people will be left to live freely in their ancestral homes and continue doing conservation, because that is who we are. That is our way of life. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you to you, Winnie, for having joined us. It was really great to have you in this discussion. And I take from the 2 points, first, the realities you've been described, which we need to hear more and more, because unfortunately, there has been such impacts all around the world of not only the pandemic itself, but also some of the measures which have been taken in order to fight against the pandemic. And I think this echoes what we've been hearing during this whole event, is that there's not only the actions which need to be taken to prevent the human rights violations from the loss of biodiversity, but also that these actions must themselves respect human rights. And that's a very, very important element. Otherwise, they just bring more disaster to what is already a very unhappy situation. So, well, thank you very much for your last words. Thank you very much for all these contributions. And sorry to be a bit late, Diana. And I turn the floor to you for the conclusions of this event.
Thank you very much, Yves. Indeed, I am not going to summarize all what you said. You will find, as I mentioned at the beginning, a summary of this event, the video and all the documents that were mentioned presented there. It would be too difficult to really highlight the very important elements that you have all raised. I will turn to David for a final word.
Merci, Diana. I would just say in closing that I would like to really express my gratitude for the organizers of this event, Earth Justice, the Geneva Environment Network, and also to the core group of states that support the mandate on human rights and the environment. So those states are Costa Rica, Morocco, the Maldives, Slovenia, and Switzerland. These states were responsible for the appointment of my predecessor, John Knox, who did a fantastic job, and they continue to support the mandate. And those states are moving forward with a joint statement in the coming week about support for a resolution on the right to a healthy environment. So I just encourage everyone to reach out to people that you know, to connect with your friends, your colleagues, and ensure that as many states as possible join with that core group in calling on the United Nations for a resolution on the right to a healthy environment. It couldn't be more timely. It's so urgently needed in light of everything we've heard today. So thank you again to everyone for your participation. My fellow panelists, as I mentioned earlier, I find all of your work tremendously inspiring. And so I'm deeply, deeply grateful to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And indeed, next week at the Human Rights Council, an important discussion will be taking place. I want to thank you all, of course, also to thank you, David, for joining us today and be able to present this important report to the community. And of course, for those who are online with us, for all the panelists, and for those who will be watching this video and look at the webpage of this event later on. Thank you very much. Don't forget to come back to the webpage to have a look at the summary that will be produced and to share it with your colleagues and friends to give more visibility to the report of the Special Rapporteur. Thank you all.